Oh, okay.
So my name is Erik Rook. I also moonlight as the Uplands coordinator for the John Day Basin Partnership. We basically, the partnership, like a little bit of background, always wanted to have basically a ridgetop to ridgetop approach for how we were going to do restoration for the John Day. And so we went through an initial process that prioritized aquatic restoration across the basin, always knowing that we wanted to also have an uplands component. And so we went through, when we initially went through that process, we did build some of the structuring for doing the prioritization, but not with mule deer necessarily specifically in mind. And so that has been like through the process, we have kind of modified a little bit of the initial structure. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go into it. We did maintain all of the sub basins across the John Day, so we didn't like modify the sub watersheds that you guys see here. So the aquatic prioritization and uplands prioritization will be based in very similar geographies. And then you guys probably can't see it, but these are some of the limiting factors that you'll be able to see in the next slide. I want to say too, if anybody has any questions about like the process and kind of what we've done at any point, just ask me as I can really go. So the basic framework for Atlas, in a nutshell, we're a really big group with a lot of sort of restoration capacity, but we need some way to prioritize our work so that we can do kind of the most effective restoration based on focal species. So for uplands work, our focal species is mule deer. One of the distinctions between the aquatic side and uplands is just the scale. So it inherently has to be a more coarse process. It's 8,000 square miles, or 8,000 square. Yeah, okay, I got that right. Thanks, so it's just going to be inherently a little bit more coarse. We're primarily using remote sensing and expert opinion to make the prioritization. And I think that's all I've got to say about that. Thanks. So far, process-wise, these are the objectives that were proposed for the prioritization process. We have completed land use. Primarily, most of the land use was, we really relied on GIS and remote sensing data. So that was like all of the different layers that we're going to use to identify areas where we can do restoration. It just helps guide the process. We've got something to look at across the whole geography to help us make decisions. That was kind of our first step. We prioritized the upland habitat limiting factors. So the limiting factors were, like I sort of said, were originally kind of designed not necessarily with mule deer in mind. So part of that process was to review all of the limiting factors, figure out which ones were applicable to mule deer, and then make sure as a group we understood what all the definitions were and what examples were before we prioritized. So that was like a whole meeting, just like what are these, and how are we going to use them? And then so obviously created a prioritization for limiting factors. With those, we created a draft prioritization of the subbasins, and that's kind of where, and then started on ranking restoration actions, but we're gonna have to do more work in the fall. Basically, we'll pause through the field season because it's like very difficult to get everybody together, and then I'm assuming probably 2 or 3 more meetings we should have a final draft that we can present to the partnership. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay, next slide. So this is our draft prioritization. I'm happy to take suggestions from anybody or comments outside of the talk. This is basically kind of where we've landed. I would say some of the big factors that have driven that prioritization have been winter range. So there's like, it's not entirely what drove that prioritization, but that is kind of a big piece that has driven which sub watersheds ranked out highest. But again, if anybody has any comments or they want to see the AGL platform, feel free to find me and I'll get you the link. Any questions?
Oh, do you want to?
Okay, highest priority is blue, so that's these three. All of the green would be like tier 2, and then everything in yellow would be tier 3. We can play with the breaks. So, you know, in GIS, you can kind of break things out either by like groups of 5, or that's called exponential break. So it's broken, you know, like the highest come out in 3, and then the middle is kind of the big group, and then the lower group is smaller. I think for the sake of chasing potential upland funds, it's nice to have the top tier group be relatively small. It makes that decision process easier, and so that's why we broke out the groups that way. But I mean, you can lie with maps, so we can break them out like however you guys want. It's pretty easy to just modify the data and make it look however you want to. So, which I shouldn't say the truth, but the truth. That's all I've got.
And on that note, thank you. Thanks, Eric. It looks like we have a chat.
So in the conversation about or species,
Like stop share and then new share.
conversation that talked about other species that would benefit from a whole pathway of this benefiting you.
Yeah, so I'll answer these questions. So Sue was asked.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you stand up here because
yeah.
they can't hear from the
No,
table?
sorry.
Thank you.
Sue was asking if we were thinking about other species, upland species that would be affected with those type of restoration actions. I think the easiest way to think about this process is that mule deer were chosen as a surrogate. So they are sort of our indicator species of upland health. And so it's, you almost have to focus on like a sort of small group of species to do this kind of work. If you're like, oh, I want to do mule deer and pollinators and like bluebirds, it'd be really, really complicated. So I think the assumption we're making is that if we do like very good restoration work for mule deer, we can assume that that work will have like kind of, you know, downstream ecosystem benefits for other species. So that's sort of the assumption. Yes, sir.
I couldn't really see the limiting factors on the slide. So could you give us an idea what limiting factors for upland treatments and kind of what's the restoration activities?
Sure.
Would be associated with
Do you
that?
want to go back? Sorry, go back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
it's
just
fine.
don't-
There's a lot of them.
Maybe if you-
Yeah.
You know, it was, so yeah, I'll make like
I can share
like
the screen.
2 4-hour meetings into like 3 minutes. So there was a slightly longer list of limiting factors that was originally developed. Again, the original development of that plan was somewhat focused on aquatic. And so we had to kind of wrestle with the original concept and tailor it to mule deer. So some of those limiting factors didn't really make sense. And likewise, some of the restoration actions were like, it's not really a restoration action that's going to affect mule deer biology. That was like a big part of kind of what we worked through. As far as limiting factors for mule deer, there's habitat quantity and habitat quality. One of those is basically a lack of habitat, and then forage would be like in that other category. Forage is probably one of our most like powerful limiting factors. And then we'll have restoration actions that we basically ask this question: how powerful is each one of these limiting factors to mule deer? And then our second round of questioning is, how powerful are these restoration actions at affecting these limiting factors? And that's kind of how the structure works, if that makes sense. And so we prioritize based on, okay, there's all these limiting factors within a subbasin that affect mule deer. This is the suite of restoration actions that we can do that will positively affect these limiting factors. Does that make sense? And so that's the basic framework. We start at like the largest geography, the largest scale, and then come down to the subbasin. And then our next step will be to come down to like basically restoration opportunity. We're just going to keep drilling down to smaller geographies. Does that answer your question at all? You don't seem satisfied.
No, that's a good consolidated 8-hour conversation.
We could spend the rest of the meeting. I would feel bad for everyone.
I'm just trying to think with upland treatments. I know there's folks that are representing the like forestry that are going to be involved in huge effort statewide, especially in our areas. John Day, you know, forest mandates and also state forest mandates that are probably in our steps as well. Relationship is good. Create a lot of elements, how that interacts with this prioritization.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really helped guide us prioritizing was thinking about example habitats that were performing really well. So that's been a really helpful tool to think about areas in the basin that are performing great as like a target. And so one of the targets, like after the canyon fire, I know it's not like a great fire for a lot of reasons, but directly thinking about mule deer habitat, the population within canyon responded powerfully. And so that's been like a really good guide for us. Like, okay, we sort of have a natural experiment. You know, this whole event happened and then mule deer populations responded dramatically. So we kind of know, like, given this sort of suite of treatments, including forestry work that isn't catastrophic,
Right.
you can get sort of positive population numbers.